I want you to imagine standing outside the most important wedding of your life. Not as a stranger, not as a distant cousin, nobody remembers, but as the woman who paid for every single thing happening behind those doors, the flowers, the chairs, the band, the dress your sister is wearing right now. And then imagine a stranger with a clipboard looking at you like, you don't belong there. That's exactly where I was standing on a warm Saturday afternoon last summer, in my best navy blue dress, holding a small wrapped gift that had been waiting 12 years to reach my sister's hands. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 34 years old. I've spent more than a decade working as an intensive care nurse, which means I've spent more nights than I can count holding the hands of strangers while they fought for their lives. I've told families the words nobody wants to hear. I've also told families the words that make them cry from relief. I had let myself hope that today might be the day my family finally let me back in. A young woman stood near the entrance with a tablet in her hand, checking names off a guest list. I smiled at her the way you smile at someone when you're nervous but trying not to show it. "Hi," I said, "Claire Dawson. I'm the bride's sister." She looked down at her tablet, scrolled again, and I watched something happen to her face that I will never forget. The color just drained out of it, like she'd seen something she wasn't prepared for. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if checking who was nearby. "Your name isn't on the list. It was removed this morning." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. Removed. As if I were an error, a typo, a name crossed out with a pen. "There has to be a mistake," I said. "I'm supposed to be here."
In that world, I learned
and that's
something
something that
her
never
voice.
left me. That the truth always comes out eventually. You can delay it. You can bury it. But it always finds its way to the surface. Usually at the worst possible moment for the people who tried to hide it. I didn't know that day would prove me right in a way I never expected. The wedding was being held at a beautiful old estate about 40 minutes outside the city. White columns, a stone fountain, rows of chairs facing an arch wrapped in white roses. I remember the smell of cut grass and candle wax in the air, the soft hum of a string quartet warming up somewhere behind the hedges. Everything about that place looked like something out of a movie, and it should have. I paid $21,000 to make sure of it. I walked up the gravel path toward the entrance, my heels clicking against the stone, my heart pounding harder than it should have for a simple family wedding. But it wasn't known my entire life.
For me.
The voice that used to sing me to sleep when I was small, now aimed at me like a blade in front of strangers. Why would we invite someone who isn't really family? My mother. She walked toward me with a calm, practiced smile on her face, the same smile she used at church, at parent, teacher, conferences, at every moment in her life when she needed people to believe she was in control. She said those words loud enough for the guests nearby to hear, loud enough that a few heads turned, loud enough that I felt every year of sacrifice I had made for this family collapse into a single sentence. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I have spent 12 years training myself not to fall apart in front of people who are watching me for a reaction. So I just stood there, looked her directly in the eyes, and said the only thing that felt true. I told her, "Then this is the last time you will ever see me as family." Then I turned around, and I walked back down that gravel path, past the white chairs, past the roses, past the fountain I had chosen from a catalog myself. 6 months earlier, I got into my car, and I drove away believing, truly believing, that I had just lost the only family I had left. What my mother did not know, what she had never bothered to find out, was that my name wasn't just on the guest list, it was on the contract. The real one, the one that legally owned that wedding from the first deposit to the final flower. And within the hour, that one detail was about to stop the ceremony before my sister ever reached the altar. But to understand how we got to that gravel path, you need to go back 12 years, to the night I found my mother sitting on our kitchen floor, surrounded by unpaid bills. The night everything in our family quietly changed forever. I want you to understand who I was before that night. Because the woman who walked away from that wedding wasn't born bitter. She was built slowly, out of 12 years of choosing silence over recognition. I grew up in a small house on a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where you could hear your neighbor's screen door slam 3 houses down. My father, Robert Dawson, worked as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was steady, reliable. The kind of father who showed up to every school event even when he was exhausted from a double shift. My mother Diane stayed home when we were young, then worked part-time at a local pharmacy. Once Emma and I were both in school, I was the older daughter, serious, responsible, the one who did her homework without being asked twice. Born when I was already old enough to remember rocking her to sleep in my arms. From the moment she came home from the hospital, I loved her the way you love something you feel responsible for keeping safe. I used to walk her to the bus stop every morning before I went to my own school. I taught her how to ride a bike in the driveway, running behind her with my hand on the seat, until she stopped needing me to hold on. We weren't a perfect family, but we were a family. My father used to say that the Dawsons might not have much, but we had each other, and that was worth more than money. I believed him completely. By the time I was 22, I was in nursing school, working part-time, at a diner to help pay for textbooks, dreaming about the day I'd finally get to work in a hospital and do ICU specifically, the sickest patients, the ones on the edge, the moments where a single decision made in seconds could be the difference between someone going home to their family or not going home at all. I wanted to be the person standing there when it mattered most. Emma was 15 at the time, still in high school, still worried about the normal things of 15-year. Old worries about friends, grades, whether a boy in her class liked her back. She looked up to me. I was her big sister, the one who let her stay up late during sleepovers, the one who drove her to the mall on weekends, the one who told her everything would be fine when our parents argued about money, which they sometimes did, quietly, behind closed doors. I didn't know then how much those quiet arguments meant. I didn't know my father had been hiding just how serious our financial short months, our entire family would be tested in a way none of us were prepared for. My father had always seemed indestructible to me. He was the kind of man who never complained about being tired, never missed a day of work in 15 years, never once made us feel like anything was wrong. So when he collapsed at work on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon from a massive stroke, none of us saw it coming. Not my mother. Not Emma. Not me. I was in the middle of a clinical rotation when I got the call. I remember standing in a hospital hallway that wasn't even the one my father had been rushed to, holding my phone, listening to my mother's voice break apart on the other end of the line. I remember driving to the hospital so fast I don't even remember most of the drive. I remember walking into that room and seeing him connected to machines I had only just started learning how to read, machines that told me, before any doctor said a word, 3 days later, he was 51 years old. I won't spend too much time on the grief itself, because grief is something most people understand without needing it explained. What I will tell you is that in the middle of losing my father, I also lost the version of my life I thought I was going to have. I thought I was going to graduate, start my career, maybe move into my own apartment, build a life slowly and carefully the way most people do in their 20s. Instead, 2 weeks after the funeral, I found my mother sitting on the kitchen floor at 11 o'clock at night, surrounded by envelopes she hadn't opened in months. And that night changed everything. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming in the background, because it was the only sound in the house besides my mother's breathing, which was shaky and uneven. The kind of breathing that comes right before someone finally lets themselves cry with her back after holding the cabinets, for too long. Her knees pulled up to her chest, papers scattered around her like she had dropped them all at once, and simply stopped trying to pick them up. I sat down beside her on the cold tile floor, and I picked up one of the envelopes. Then, another. Mortgage statement. Overdue notice. Credit card bill. Insurance premium. Another mortgage statement. This one stamped in red. I didn't know how bad it was, she whispered. Your father handled all of this. I never even looked at the numbers. I trusted him to take care of it, and now I don't know what to do. I want to be honest with you about something. In that moment I wasn't thinking about myself. I wasn't thinking about my nursing career, or my future, or the life I had imagined on a kitchen floor with unpaid bills spread out like a losing hand of cards, looking at my mother, a 50-year-old woman who had just lost her husband and had no idea how she was going to keep the roof over her family's head, and all I could think was, someone has to fix this. We'll figure it out, I told her. I'll help. She looked at me then, and she said something I have thought about almost every day since. She grabbed my hand, and she made me promise that Emma would never know how bad things had gotten. Emma was 15. My mother believed with everything in her that a 15-year-old girl deserved to grieve her father without also carrying the weight of knowing her family might lose their home. She believed Emma deserved a normal life, a childhood that didn't feel like survival. Promise me she won't know where the money comes from. You'll let me handle this, my mother said. And you'll let her believe I'm the one holding this family together. I promised. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that promise is the single decision that shaped the next 12 years of my life. I made it at 22 years old, grieving my father, sitting on a kitchen floor, wanting nothing more than to protect the people I loved. I didn't think about what it would cost me. I only thought about what it would save Emma from. Looking back now, I understand my mother's intentions came from love. I still believe that, even after everything that happened later. But I also understand something else now that I didn't understand then, that a promise made in grief without any boundaries or endpoint can quietly become a cage. And I stayed in that cage for 12 years, telling myself every single day that silent sacrifice was the same thing as love. It isn't. After that night, but it took me over a decade to learn everything in my life reorganized itself around one goal, keeping my family afloat without Emma ever knowing the truth. I finished nursing school 8 months later. The day I got my license, I remember feeling a strange mixture of pride and dread, because I knew exactly what that license meant. It meant I could finally start working full-time. It meant real income. And it meant the beginning of what would become 12 years of quiet, invisible sacrifice. I took a job in the ICU at a hospital about 30 minutes from home. I specifically requested night shifts because they paid a differential extra money per hour just for working when most of the world was asleep. It meant I would miss things, family dinners, holidays, birthdays, but it also meant more money. And more money meant my mother could keep the house. Every 2 weeks, I sat down with my paycheck and split it in my head before I even hit my went directly into an account my mother controlled. I paid the mortgage. I paid to fix the roof after a storm damaged it 2 years in. I paid off my father's remaining medical bills, the ones the insurance didn't cover. When Emma needed braces, I paid for them. When her school announced a class trip to Washington, D.C. that cost more than my mother could explain to Emma without arousing suspicion, I paid for that too, and my mother told her a scholarship covered it. Every single dollar passed through my mother's hands first. That was the arrangement. That was the promise. To the outside world and eventually to Emma herself, it looked like my mother was the one holding our family together after tragedy. She became, in the eyes of everyone who knew us, the strong widow who had rebuilt everything from nothing. Neighbors admired her. Relatives praised her. People at church told her how proud my father would be of the way she had held the family together. While my mother was quietly cashing my sacrifice and wearing it as her own strength, I was becoming, in everyone's eyes, the daughter who had drifted away. The one who missed birthdays because she was always working. The one who didn't call enough. The one who, according to whispers I sometimes caught at family gatherings I wasn't invited to, seemed to have forgotten where she came from. I want to explain something about working night shifts in an ICU, because I think it matters for understanding how easily this narrative took hold. When you work nights, your schedule doesn't match anyone else's. You're asleep during the day when everyone else is awake and making plans. Your heart monitor beeps unevenly, while somewhere across town, your family is having a barbecue you weren't invited to, or you were invited to but couldn't attend, because you'd worked a double the night before and needed the 4 hours of sleep just to function safely at your next shift. My mother used that schedule as a weapon, whether she meant to or not. Every missed event became proof of my absence. Every declined invitation, which I always explained honestly. I have a shift. I'm sorry. I wish I could be there, became, in the retelling, evidence that I simply didn't prioritize my family anymore. She never had to lie outright. She just let the silence do the talking. And silence, I learned, is one of the most effective tools for rewriting a story. Emma, meanwhile, was growing into a teenager, then a young woman, further and further away from me with every year. Her school plays I couldn't attend because of my shift schedule. Her prom photos I saw days later on social media instead of in person. Her high school graduation where I sat in the back because there wasn't a seat saved for me up front. I remember standing outside that graduation ceremony afterward, watching her get hugged by cousins and aunts and family friends. All of them telling her how proud they were, how hard our mother had worked to give her this moment. I stood a little apart from the group, and when Emma finally turned and saw me, she smiled. A real smile, the kind she used to give me when she was small, and she said, "I'm glad you could make it this time." This time, as if my presence was the exception, instead of something I desperately wanted to be the rule. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain the shift I had swapped with a coworker just to be there, the sleep I had sacrificed, the exhaustion I was hiding behind, and I kept my promise, even when it was slowly erasing me from my own sister's memory of who had actually shown up for her. If I tried to tell you every single moment across those 12 years, we would be here far longer than an hour. So let me give you a few, because I think they'll tell you everything you need to know about what silence costs. There was the year Emma turned 18, and I paid for nearly all of her first semester of college, a state school, but still expensive by our family's standards, while my mother told relatives she had found a way to make it work after years of careful saving. I sat in my apartment that week, alone, having just come off a 60-hour work week, transferring the tuition payment from my account into hers, and I remember feeling something I hadn't let myself feel before, not just tiredness. Something closer to grief. Grief for a version of sisterhood I wasn't getting to have. So a coworker with 3 young children could be home with her kids. And when I finally arrived at my mother's house near midnight, exhausted, still in scrubs, Emma was already asleep. And my mother met me at the door only to tell me, quietly, that maybe next year I could plan better. There was the time Emma called me crying after a breakup with her first serious boyfriend. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like we were sisters again, close the way we used to be. I stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours after a 12-hour shift, barely able to keep my eyes open, just so she wouldn't feel alone. 2 weeks later, at a family dinner, I wasn't invited to. My mother told everyone how she had been the one to help Emma through it. I found out only because a cousin mentioned it to me in passing, assuming I already knew. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you because I think it's important for you to understand exactly how a person can spend over a decade holding a family together financially, while simultaneously being erased from that family emotionally. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in 1,000 small moments, each one small enough to excuse, until one day you look up and realize 12 years have passed, and you are a stranger in your own family's story. There were nights, more than I'd like to admit, when I sat alone in my apartment after a brutal shift, looking at old photos on my phone, Emma at 6 years old, riding the bike I taught her to ride, laughing so hard she almost fell off, my hand steady on the seat behind her, and I wondered if she even remembered that I was the one who taught her. I wondered if, in her memory, our mother had somehow been there too, the way she seemed to be in every other retelling of our family's story. I never confronted my mother about any of this. I told myself Emma was still adjusting to college, or to her new job, or to her new relationship. And that bringing up old grievances would only cause unnecessary pain. I told myself the promise I made on that kitchen floor was more important than my own need to be seen. What I didn't realize, not fully, not until much later, was that protecting Emma from the truth had somehow become indistinguishable, in my mother's hands, from protecting herself from ever having to acknowledge what I had given up. The two things had become the same lie, wearing the same explanation, and I had been the one paying for both. Then, 4 years ago, Emma met a man named Ethan Whitfield at a mutual friend's birthday party, and everything that had been quietly building for over a decade started moving toward the moment I stood on that gravel path, holding a gift that had waited 12 years before the wedding. which was itself unusual because by that point our phone calls had become rare, mostly logistical, mostly brief. But this call was different. She was excited in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "Claire, I found the venue," she said. "It's perfect. It's everything I've ever dreamed of. But it's expensive, and Mom says we might have to look at somewhere smaller." She sent me photos, white columns, a stone fountain, gardens that looked like something from a painting. I could hear it in her voice. This wasn't just a venue to her. This was the wedding she had been imagining since she was a little girl. The one we used to talk about when she was small. Back before the distance grew between us. Back when she'd ask me what my wedding would look like, and I'd ask her what hers would look like, and she'd describe exactly this. White columns, a garden, string lights at night. I didn't think twice. The venue myself. I told her the next day. The total cost, including catering, was just over $21,000. I paid the deposit that same week using my own card under my own name, because the venue required whoever held the card to be listed as the official client of record on the contract. It was a standard policy. The coordinator explained. Liability, accountability, that kind of thing. I signed my name, Claire Dawson, at the bottom of a contract that legally made me the client responsible for every decision related to that wedding. My mother, when she found out, insisted on one thing. She wanted to remain listed as the primary point of contact for all day-to-day communication with the venue, the tastings, the seating chart, the vendor calls, so that I, in her words, wouldn't be disturbed while working. I remember her saying it almost gently, like she was doing me a favor, sparing me the burden of planning on top of my demanding hospital schedule. I agreed. By that point, agreeing to let my mother manage the visible parts of our family's life, while I quietly managed the invisible ones, had become so automatic, I didn't even pause to consider what it meant. I had no idea that single decision, remaining the legal client while stepping back from the day-to-day communication, was about to become the exact detail that would stop a wedding ceremony in its tracks. For the next several months, the wedding planning moved forward entirely without me. I wasn't included in the dress fittings. I wasn't invited to the tasting where they chose the menu I was paying for. There was no invitation to the bridal shower. No invitation to the bachelorette weekend. No seat saved at the rehearsal dinner after they had already happened, usually through photos posted online. My mother and Emma smiling together in a boutique dressing room. Captions thanking the best mom in the world for making the wedding of Emma's dreams possible. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It hurt more than almost anything else across those 12 years, because this wasn't a missed birthday or a busy holiday season. This was my sister's wedding. The wedding I was quite literally funding in full, and I was being written out of its story in real time, replaced in every visible way by the woman who had spent over a decade taking credit for sacrifices that weren't hers to claim. But then, about 8 weeks before the wedding, something happened that gave me hope I hadn't let myself feel in years. Tucked between a phone bill and a grocery store flyer, a cream-colored envelope, with my name written in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Because it was the same handwriting I had watched develop from clumsy kindergarten letters into elegant cursive over 20 years of birthday cards, and notes passed between our bedrooms. Inside was the wedding invitation. The formal one. The kind with the delicate script and the tissue paper insert. The kind that had clearly been professionally printed for the entire guest list. But tucked behind it was something else. A small folded note, handwritten, that Emma had clearly added herself before sealing the envelope. Asterisk, are you coming? Please. I mailed this one myself. I sat at my kitchen table and read those words maybe a dozen times. That told me everything I needed to know about what had likely happened to my invitation in the official process. That somewhere between the printer and the mailbox, my name may have quietly disappeared from the list. My mother controlled, and Emma, somehow sensing that, had taken matters into her own hands. I want you to understand what that note did to me. For years I had convinced myself that Emma's distance from me was simply the natural result of growing up, of living her own life, of the scheduled differences that came with my career. That note told me something different. It told me that some part of my sister, the little girl who used to ask me to check under her bed for monsters, who used to fall asleep in my lap during long car rides, still remembered me, still wanted me there, still, in whatever quiet way she could manage, was reaching across the distance our mother had built. And we talked for almost 2 hours, longer than we had talked in years. She told me about Ethan, about how he made her laugh even on her worst days, about how his father Richard had walked him through some difficult advice about marriage, after his own health scare a couple of years back. She told me she wanted me there, not just as a guest, but as her sister. She apologized in her own way, for how distant things had become, though she didn't seem to fully understand why. I didn't explain it to her that night. I told myself there would be time for that conversation later. After the wedding, when things had settled and I could find the right words, I should have told her everything that night. I know that now, but I still believed, foolishly perhaps, that my mother's promise from 12 years earlier still mattered more than my own need, and I told Emma simply that of course I was coming, that nothing could keep me away. For 8 weeks, I let myself hope. I bought a new dress. I picked out a gift, my father's wristwatch, the one my mother had given to me for safekeeping years earlier, restored and cleaned. Something I planned to give to Emma as a reminder that our father, in some way, would be there too. I imagined, more times than I want to admit, what it might feel like to finally sit among family at an event that mattered, to finally feel like I belonged somewhere I had spent 12 years paying to protect. I did not imagine what actually happened when I arrived. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early, the way you do when you're nervous about something important. I made coffee. I got dressed slowly, carefully, the way you do when you want it for a long time before wrapping it, running my thumb over the worn leather band, remembering the way it used to look on his wrist at the dinner table, at church, at every ordinary family moment I hadn't known yet to treasure. The drive to the venue took just under an hour. I remember the sun was bright, the sky almost unbelievably blue, the kind of day that seems designed for a wedding. I remember feeling something close to peace for the first time in a long time. A quiet hope that today, finally, after 12 years, I would get to simply exist as Emma's sister, without hiding, without calculation, without a promise standing between us. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took to reach the check-in table. I've already told you what happened there. The coordinator's face going pale, the words removed this morning, my mother's voice cutting through the crowd. I won't relive that moment. Felt like walking back to my car afterward, because I think that part matters just as much as what came next. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I made it all the way to my car, sat down in the driver's seat, closed the door, and only then did I let myself fall apart. I sat there for what felt like a long time, my hands shaking, the small wrapped gift still sitting on the passenger seat beside me, my father's watch inside it, a gift I no longer knew if I would ever get to give. I thought about the 12 years. I thought about the night shifts, the missed birthdays, the tuition payments, the mortgage, the roof repairs, the braces, the DC trip, all of it. 12 years of choosing silence, because I believed it was an act of love, and in that moment, sitting in a parking lot in my best dress, I finally let myself feel the full weight of a question I had been avoiding for over a decade. What if silence was dressed up as sacrifice, and I had spent 12 years mistaking one for the other? I started the engine. I told myself I was done. Not angry, not vengeful. Just done. In the quiet, exhausted way, you're done with something that has cost you more than it ever gave back. I pulled out of the parking lot and began the drive home, believing, in that moment, that I had just lost my family for good. I had no idea that back at the venue, in the minutes after I drove away, everything was about to change. Here is something I didn't know until later, pieced together from what Ethan, Richard, and the coordinator told me afterward. But I think it's important you understand exactly how the truth came out, because it wasn't through some elaborate plan. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was simply a contract doing exactly what a contract is designed to do. The coordinator, a young woman named Sophia, had been uneasy the moment the exchange didn't sit right with her. The panic in my face. The calm cruelty in my mother's voice. The fact that a name removal request had come through so last minute, with no documentation behind it. Venue policy, she explained, required written approval from the client of record for any major change to the guest list or event details. My mother had verbally requested my removal that morning, and the on-site staff, trying to accommodate the family on the day of the event, had complied without realizing they'd skipped a required step. After I left, Sophia pulled up the contract file to close out the paperwork, standard procedure at the end of any event. That's when she saw it, the client of record, the name legally responsible for the entire booking, the person whose signature authorized every payment, every change, every decision, wasn't Diane Dawson. It was Claire Dawson. A wave of panic, because it meant the venue had just violated its own contract by allowing a change to be made without the actual client's written consent. She did what any responsible coordinator would do. She went to find the groom immediately because the situation needed to be addressed before the ceremony could proceed without risking a serious liability issue for the venue. Ethan, I'm told, was stunned. He had always known vaguely that the family had helped cover the cost of the wedding, but he had believed, like everyone else, that it was primarily my mother's doing. When Sophia explained that the entire $21,000 contract was under my name and that I was the sister who had just been turned away at the door, something shifted in his expression. Standing beside him at that moment was his father, that still gives me chills when I think about it. Because of everything that could have happened that day. This coincidence is the one I never could have planned. 2 years earlier, Richard had suffered a massive heart attack. He was brought into the ICU where I worked. In critical condition, on a night. I remember clearly because it was one of the hardest shifts of my career. I stayed with him through the worst of it, monitoring him, adjusting his care, sitting with him during the long, frightening hours when his family couldn't be in the room. I remember holding his hand at one point when his oxygen levels dropped suddenly, talking him through it, telling him to keep breathing, that I wasn't going anywhere. He survived. He recovered. And like a lot of patients who go through something like that, he never forgot the nurse who stayed. When Sophia said my name, Claire Dawson, Richard told Ethan he recognized it, and when Ethan described me, Richard knew for certain. This was the nurse who had stayed beside him through the worst nights of his life. The one who never gave up on him even when things looked bleak. And now, here she was, revealed as the same woman everyone in this family had quietly written off as absent, uninvolved, uncaring, when in fact she had been the one holding this family together financially for over a decade, including funding the very wedding she'd just been turned away from. Richard didn't hesitate. He told Ethan the ceremony needed to stop until this was addressed, that something was deeply wrong, and that Emma deserved to know the truth before she walked down the aisle believing a version of her family's story that wasn't accurate. The ceremony paused. Guests began murmuring, confused, phones lighting up around the venue as staff quietly tried to manage something was wrong, demanded to know what was happening. I found out about most of this after the fact, but I do remember, vividly, the moment my phone rang while I was driving home, my eyes still swollen from crying in the parking lot. It was Emma. I almost didn't answer. Part of me assumed it would be another painful conversation, another attempt to smooth things over without actually addressing what had happened. But something made me pick up. She was crying, not the composed, quiet crying of someone managing a difficult moment, but the raw, breathless crying of someone whose entire understanding of her family had just cracked open in front of her. Claire, she said, her voice shaking, is it true? Did you pay for all of it? The house, my college, this wedding, is it true? I sat with that question for a moment. 12 years of silence pressed up against a single moment of choice. I protected my mother the way I promised to, even now, even after everything. But I was so tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion from work, deeper than the tiredness of that particular day. I was tired of a promise that had cost me more than it had ever protected. Yes, I said. One word, the first honest word I had spoken about any of it in 12 years. Emma didn't say anything for a long moment. I could hear her crying on the other end, and somewhere behind her, muffled voices, the sound of a wedding suspended in confusion. Then she asked me to come back. I want to be honest about something. Part of me hesitated. Part of me, the part that had been rejected in front of strangers just an hour earlier, wanted to say no, to protect whatever was left of my own dignity, to let the silence I'd kept for so long finally work in my favor by simply staying gone. But that wasn't who I was. When I arrived back at the venue, I turned the atmosphere was completely different from the one I had walked into that morning. Guests stood in small, hushed clusters. My mother was standing near the arch of white roses, her face pale, no longer wearing the calm, controlled smile from earlier. And Emma was waiting near the entrance, still in her wedding dress, holding something in her hands. It was my father's watch, the gift I had left behind in my car. No, that's not right. I had actually brought it inside earlier that morning, intending to give it to her before the ceremony. And in the chaos of being turned away, I'd left the small wrapped box with Sophia at the check in table, asking her to make sure Emma received it regardless of what happened. Sophia had given it to Emma once the truth came out, and Emma had unwrapped it, understanding immediately what it meant. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She simply looked at me, held out her hand, and asked me to walk undeniable, her down the aisle. In front of everyone who had ever believed the version of our family's story my mother had spent 12 years carefully constructing. I want to end this the way I started it, with honesty, because I think that's the only thing that ever really mattered in this entire story. In the months since that wedding, my relationship with Emma has changed in ways I couldn't have imagined 12 years ago. We talk now, really talk, the way sisters are supposed to. She's asked me questions about those years that I've answered. Honestly, even when the answers were hard for both of us to sit with. She's apologized for things that weren't her fault, for believing a story she was never given the full information to question. I've told her more than once that she has nothing to apologize for. She was protected the exact way she was meant to be protected. The only person who owes an apology is the one who built my mother is more complicated, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending. We've talked. She's cried. She's told me, in her own way, that she believed she was doing right by both of her daughters, that she never meant for the sacrifice to become invisible, that somewhere along the way, protecting Emma and protecting her own image blurred together, until she couldn't tell the difference anymore. I believe she believes that. I'm not sure it changes what those 12 years cost me. We are still finding our way toward whatever our relationship is going to become. Some days that feels hopeful. Some days it doesn't. I've learned to be at peace with not knowing yet. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. Silence can feel like love. It can feel noble, even necessary. Especially when you're young and grieving and desperate what had happened with our mother. Not then. There would be time for that conversation later, and there was a long, difficult, necessary conversation that happened weeks afterward. One that involved a lot of tears, a lot of hard truths, and the slow, ongoing process of rebuilding a relationship between a mother and a daughter that had been built for over a decade on a foundation of unspoken debt. But in that moment, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was walking Emma down the same path where I had been rejected just hours earlier. This time not as someone erased from the story, but as someone finally standing in the middle of it. There was no dramatic speech, no public confrontation, no moment where I turned to the crowd and delivered some triumphant explanation of everything my mother had done. I didn't need one. The truth, once it was finally out in the open, didn't need my long stops being a gift and starts being a debt, one that only you are paying, while someone else quietly spends the credit. Real love doesn't need to hide forever. It doesn't need a cover story. And sooner or later, whether through a contract nobody thought to read, or a coincidence involving a man whose life you once helped save, or simply the slow accumulation of truths too heavy to keep carrying alone, the truth finds its way into the light. And when it does, no story built on top of it, no matter how carefully constructed, no matter how many years it's had to settle in as fact, is strong enough to stand in its way. My name is Claire Dawson. I spent 12 years being the quiet foundation underneath my family's story. I'm done being quiet now. And if you've ever sacrificed something enormous for someone you love, without ever asking for the credit, I hope this story reminds you of something important. You are allowed to be thanked. You are allowed to love that requires you to disappear was never love to begin with. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, stay with me. There are more stories like this one still to come.